Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways I use these ideas in teaching my students was to say ideas like bureaucracy, the idea that you can design a policy that will solve problems in some simplistic manner. You've got to actually allow for exceptions for recognizing it when it isn't working, doesn't work, can't work. I always say it's all very well having rules. Every time something goes wrong, we can add another rule to make sure that never happens again mentality.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Munisquare Podcast, where we mix things up and offer fresh perspectives on public service and local government. I'm Nancy Hess, and if you like what we're doing here, do subscribe to our Substack and help this new venture grow. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Mike Rowe, lecturer in the public administration at the University of Liverpool. Together, we'll explore the modern classic James C. Scott's 1998 book, Seeing Like a State: How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. Scott, who taught in Yale's Department of Political Science, ranged far beyond that field, drawing on anthropology, agrarian and environmental studies, and social policy. Because this is our first recorded conversation about his work, and because Scott's ideas are both wide-ranging and delightfully provocative, I'm doing things a little differently. You'll hear short explainers sprinkled between our clips to keep the through line clear. The key notions we'll touch on today are: 1. Everyday forms of resistance, the quiet ways people push back against authority. 2. Legibility, how governments make society readable in order to govern it. 3. Simplification, our urge to tame complex systems with science and technology. And 4. High modernism, those utopian top-down ambitions that take legibility and simplification to extremes. Scott's central point is that the practical know-how of ordinary people ultimately keeps such grand schemes in check. He isn't preaching an ideology. He's inviting us to weigh both the intended and unintended consequences of the way we deliver services, including taxation, zoning, planning, policy administration, the whole lot. Efficiency and modernization may be our North Star, but he asks us, to what end? So let's get started. Thank you for being here, and I'll pop back in from time to time with a bit more context as we go. Mike starts by explaining how he discovered Scott's work at the intersection of public administration and anthropology. This interdisciplinary approach is crucial because it helps us see patterns of resistance that pure policy analysis might miss.
So my teaching in the past was around, I led a master's in public administration at Liverpool. And so I was always reading around ideas of the state. And with my research interest being anthropological, ethnographic, I came across James C. Scott at some points as the crossover of those two interests. I'd read some work that looked at anthropologies of the state, and that obviously referred immediately to James C. Scott as a key author on the subject. So I picked that by chance, really. It wasn't some kind of search for his work. It was just references that I followed up really kind of some haphazard way that one does sometimes.
Yeah, and was it Seen Like a State that came up first?
Yeah. And then I've traced back in works to the moral economy of the peasants, the domination arts of resistance, weapons of the weak, and then subsequently the art of not being governed, which I have a particular fondness for various reasons. And there's the 2 Cheers for Anarchism, which I think is a slightly more mischievous read, but entertaining.
I have all of these to look forward to. I've tried to catch a lot of his articles, and I've heard a couple podcasts talk about In Praise of Floods, and I'm really fascinated in particular by that. And I read in Seeing Like a State the quote, something to the effect of, Japanese erosion control is like a chess game. I thought, he's been thinking about this a long time, and we forget the original intent of the flood, that it was also something we need. And that's the theme that winds through his whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it really interesting. I tried to get students on the master's level to engage with it, but with little success, because when you're teaching people in public administration, seeing like a state and the art of not being governed feel a bit more challenging than sometimes they're comfortable with. But with PhD students, I found it very useful. I had one student studying the repeat disasters in Indonesia. He was from a province called Garut that regularly has floods every year. And they respond to the floods in emergency mode, but never think long term. What he was arguing was that failure to think about the river in the way perhaps James C. Scott does, which I've not read, that failure to understand it as an organism, almost a living thing that you have to work with rather than against. We set ourselves up for further disasters. So he actually drew upon animism, the old beliefs that were about not trespassing into wooded slopes above a certain level, because once you do that, you cause the river to be angry, if you like. So you don't transgress those boundaries because of the consequences. That idea that animism is about encoding a relationship between humans and nature is quite an interesting one, I think.
That's fascinating. From community protests to complaints at town hall to union grievances in the workplace, we understand what formal resistance looks like in an open society. But what James C. Scott points out is that individual and collective acts of resistance are often hidden in the fabric of everyday life. Consider how citizens create workarounds when regulations don't make sense. The food truck that parks just outside the restricted zone, the homeowner who waits to pull permits until after the work is done, the community garden that springs up on vacant land without official permission. These aren't necessarily acts of rebellion. They're adaptations that allow life to function despite rigid rules. Scott shows us that our governing and leadership might choose to acknowledge these local adaptations as a sign of healthy resistance. Note that Scott borrows the Greek term metis to describe the kind of practical knowledge that comes from experience, the know-how that can't be easily written down or taught in a classroom. A city planner might know the traffic flow equations, but a longtime resident knows that nobody uses that intersection during school pickup hours. Both kinds of knowledge matter, but Scott argues that we've systematically devalued metis in favor of technical expertise. To understand how these acts of resistance emerge, we need to first grasp one of Scott's key concepts, legibility. Mike and I explore this through a contemporary example. The public administration piece, you said, it was not always a comfortable topic for your class. Yeah, I have felt from the beginning of my work with my clients who all have their MPAs that they are very wed to the ideas of progress through science and technology. It's just the way they're wired. And his work helps me understand and be sympathetic. I have that in myself too. I like order. I like predictability. I see the value. But at the same time, because I come from organization development, I said, well, you have to start from the ground up. You have to start with the people. This isn't about a top-down will be done in the workplace. You have to figure out first what's going on, like what does the work entail? And all of these attempts was always about, could I write the job description that would encompass this? I could never quite combine the two. So now I'm more clear, not just because of James C. Scott, but he helped confirm this, like job descriptions are one thing. And then your organization development work is a completely other thing. And had that shared learning and local knowledge and all of the things that I feel like now I'm much better and confident to talk about because I understand it's a completely different thing.
There's quite a lot of work that looks at that. There's so much about organization that you can't write down and specify. There's very small things that you notice when they're gone, but don't necessarily value when you have them. I think back to my first years at Liverpool, there were two women who managed the reception and the kind of building and maintenance. They basically kept the place alive and ticking over. And if you crossed them in any way, shape or form, they could make your life misery if they really wanted to. So one of the first lessons I taught my master's students was, when you look at this building, who do you talk to most? Who do you rely on for help and advice? It's these two women who, formally speaking, have no role in your education, and yet they're very important to it. So what does that tell you?
Budget cuts, positions that are cut, they're not essential functions. And so we're going to let them go. And then you'll hear staff say, that person might work for peanuts.
Yeah.
And did all of organization of this particular project, no conference with the faculty about how we want to do these cuts. It's just straight, these are not core functions. We're getting rid of it and missing that piece of what are the connectors, what happens between the spaces that are actually making us or helping us feel a part of a community and a tight-knit fabric feel of the organization. Imagine trying to govern a forest where every tree has a local name, where villagers have customary rights to gather dead wood, where the boundaries shift with the seasons. Now imagine replacing that with neat rows of Norway spruce, each tree numbered in a grid pattern. That's legibility. Governments need to see what they govern, to count it, tax it, regulate it. Scott takes us back to the origins of this impulse, the creation of permanent last names, such as Johnson, which equals John's son, the standardization of measurements, the drawing of fixed boundaries. Before cadastral maps, land was known by use and custom. After, it became parcels with numbers. In modern terms, think of how your work gets reduced to performance metrics, how neighborhoods become census tracts, how students become test scores. The question isn't whether we need some level of legibility. We do. The question is what gets lost in the translation and whether we remember that the map is not the territory.
I think Tom referred to it in his recent posting on Substack, that idea of nothing about us without us is about us. I can't remember the exact word. The idea that top-down view of planning and thinking about government is fundamentally flawed. If you think about policy in many areas like social policy, which is more my familiar territory, you can write as many rules and policies and statements about your ambitions as you want, but they only become alive when one citizen encounters the state and asks for help or a service. And at that point, the policy becomes real. You see variation, different interpretations of all these written instructions. One office or one city versus another will have different resource commitments to these policies. So actually what that policy is suddenly becomes real. And you begin to realize that it's not one thing, it's many things. And I connect all these ideas together with Michael Lipsky's street level bureaucracy. Okay, so that again, I don't think James C. Scott and Michael Lipsky would have seen necessarily eye to eye, but I don't think they would have been in conflict. Certainly they read well together in my perspective, because Lipsky looks from the street level, or at the street level, and says, what is policy there, in a sense? How do the discretionary decisions of individuals make policy come alive?
Let's try an example of a social policy, what Scott refers to as legibility, that's attempt to take an abstract to simplify what is otherwise a kind of a complex situation or environment and make it legible and to simplify. So we come to a social policy, if that follows correctly. So give us an example that might help us work through that particular idea of his and what it results in.
I'm thinking just in terms of recent and contemporary debates, if we think of a policy area like immigration, so the tendency is to make it simple and paint in very broad brushes in terms of characterizing immigration as illegal, as about criminals, as about all sorts of other agendas over it without getting anywhere near the complexity of the legal frameworks, the international obligations, and so forth that surround the subject.
I think that is a good example in the sense that we are lured into this idea. The problem here is that we haven't been specific enough about our policies, which people could debate. We have the policies. The difficulty is implementing them in a way that is meaningful, that becomes something that is based not just on a top-down, as we say, the desire for some control. See, the administrative state by itself, there's nothing pernicious about that. It's when it begins to elevate to one of control. And that's where you get what is the motivation behind that immigration policy, or take another social policy. And I can get very down to the organization level. You have a policy, say, we have a policy for that. But in fact, when you begin to implement it, because somebody is now challenging it, you have much more complex and rich, and then you have to get together and say, you mean this? Did we mean that? What about this situation? And so at a national level, it becomes much more cumbersome. And James C. Scott, he never is prescriptive. He doesn't come out the other side and say, and so we do this. He's basically saying is that if we are in a position and we're trying to create order for the social good, we have to look through these different lenses. When we say best practices, we're often engaging in what Scott calls simplification, the belief that complex local knowledge can be reduced to universal principles. Consider the difference between a master gardener who knows this corner of the yard stays wet in the spring, and that those trees create afternoon shade, that the previous owner planted mint, which will take over if not controlled, versus someone working from a standardized landscaping checklist. The checklist is transferable, scalable, efficient, but it can't capture decades of observation. Scott's agricultural examples remain painfully relevant. Modern industrial farming reduces the complex ecosystem of traditional farming to simple inputs and outputs, standardized seeds, prescribed fertilizers, predetermined planting dates. When agricultural extension agents replaced farmers' accumulated wisdom with scientific farming manuals, yields initially increased. But soil depletion, pest problems, and crop failures followed when the simplified system couldn't respond to local variations. The same patterns appear in urban planning, education reform, and healthcare management. We extract general principles from successful examples, create standardized procedures, and then wonder why the results disappoint. By the way, the term cadastral refers to the comprehensive mapping and recording of land ownership for taxation purposes. When governments create cadastral maps, they're doing more than drawing lines. They're redefining customary relationships with land into fixed legal property. Scott shows how this process, beginning in Europe in the 18th century, made land legible to the state but often destroyed complex systems of common use, seasonal access, and informal agreements that has sustained communities for centuries. This drive to make society legible has deep historical roots. Mike and I discuss examples, and we will introduce how cadastral mapping impacts us today. So I've always liked planning, love to interview planners, but I have been, over the years of my work with local government, become an anti-sprawl person. I think Scott helps us look through different lenses and say, are you creating this as a profit center? Are we doing this expressly for profit, or do we have at the heart of this the common good of the people? And does it respond to their wants and desires? What you can hear managers say at the municipal level is that there is rhetoric and policy, but that it's very difficult to implement it precisely because you're usually up against interest groups and stakeholders that are going to use their political will to make something happen that may not necessarily be what the community wants.
You get into the situation that we've had in this country of spending an inordinate amount of time around planning, permissions, consulting, and trying to make the best plans possible, but you end up either taking an inordinate amount of time doing it, or it certainly can cost a lot of money. Proposals for a new high-speed rail link between London and the north have been under development for decades, it seems to me, and they've scarcely progressed very far. There's an example of a debate that went on for some time about where the line should go, part of the countryside, because of endangered species in some woodland not far from the railway line. Now, how far does it have to be from the railway line to become part of the discussion about what is the common good? A mile, 2 miles, 3? So it becomes very difficult to work in those ways. You say you have a fondness for planning. There's another connection I make in my mind. It was a guy who was a planner, and over the years, he developed a real interest in the working class housing projects of the past that were higgledy-piggledy, each built their own house. You had a little plot of land, and so the street was just all sorts of styles and sizes and colours and shapes. So vernacular building, if you like, as opposed to planning as we see it these days. He developed as an anarchist, much like James C. Scott. He wrote a beautiful book called Anarchy in Action. And I think, like James C. Scott, not an anarchist in wearing black and going to the barricades or anything like that. He's an anarchist in the small acts of resistance. For Colin Ward, anarchy is all around us. We just don't see it. Much of what we do is not regulated by law. We walk down the street. We manage to do that without bumping into each other because we negotiate in small ways all the time. We're constantly coordinating our actions with others without anybody needing to tell us to do it. He finds anarchy in the small bits of life and argues that there is potential for there to be more anarchy, if you like. So less state interference, less regulation, which is better, perhaps a better way, more akin to the way James C. Scott would think about it. The art of not being governed, for me, I found really fascinating because he looks at the historical evidence for the presence of settled communities and writing systems, and etc., in the past that haven't survived to the present. He identifies some peoples that appear to have abandoned writing and the settled way of life to return to a more nomadic, unsettled, withdrawing from the plains where they were growing rice back into the hills with a much more subsistence lifestyle because of the encroachment of an emergent state. That's also the legibility, isn't it? Once you're settled and static, you can be counted, named, taxed, and subjected to authority. And so that kind of withdrawal, literally, that's as resistance. There's nothing more, no better example than just completely withdrawing from it. And I should use this example with the police in England, and I say to them, you think of those high-rise blocks of flats that you would never dream of living in, and you can't understand what it would be like to live in those places. But actually, what's really interesting is police officers, you very rarely go in them as well. So people, once they're in there, there's a lot goes on in there that you'll never know about. Some people choose to go to housing estates, we'd call them projects or similar, where there is a culture of resistance to the state. So that would be the police, but also social workers or other do-gooding liberals coming here to tell us how to live our lives. So for me, this is the modern version of what Scott talks about. You don't want to have your name on the rent book. You don't want to have your name on the electoral register. You try to keep your name out as much as possible for whatever reason.
But it brings you to this cadastral mapping, if I'm saying that correctly, cadastral. But that was this idea that how can you extract taxes if they don't make the land legible, carving out all the plots of land and then assessing how they're going to tax the landowners or the workers. It's a really fascinating story, and it is so central and fundamental that we don't even think about it today. And yet it's another example of local zoning ordinances. Pennsylvania's local zoning ordinances could vary from region. We have very small government, so it's a real patchwork. And they're always being challenged. We don't really think about the origin of this zoning. Scott's just saying, this is the way, nothing inherently wrong, but if you don't recognize what you're disrupting, you lose the value of the bartering, the things that used to go on, whether you were borrowing wood from the forest or animals that you were foraging or anything that was happening locally before those lines were drawn. High modernism and Brasilia. When legibility combines with unchecked power and utopian vision, Scott warns us, we get what we call high modernism. Our discussion of Brasilia shows what happens when planners try to create a rational city from scratch. A quick footnote. I mentioned the name Le Corbusier, a Swiss-French architectural designer, painter, urban planner, and writer who was also a pioneer of what we now regard as modern architecture. And he greatly influenced Lucio Costa, the architect and urban planner who's best known for his plan for Brasilia. So what we're talking about really is the messiness of local life. And I think that's a part that we have to take a moment and say, it's just the way it's going to be. It's never going to be a clear, and we hope it's not too legible and too simplified, because then we would be miserable in another way. I'd like to talk a little bit about high modernism, because that's a particular term that I had to take some time to understand, but I think it's useful because it has to do with these utopian ideas, what he refers to as grand schemes. And because Eduardo is part of our Munisquare community, and we were able to do a podcast with an architect who knew Brasilia very well. And this is an example in Scott's like estate. One of my favorite examples, really, because anyone who is interested in architecture, maybe they've traveled to Russia, they're impressed with some of that architecture, and they go to Brasilia and they just see these towering buildings. The vision of that city, which is Le Corbusier, I believe is how to pronounce. It's so big. That's the whole idea, to make it as big and grand as possible, because they saw a design for society that would never have to leave their tower. There's a big tower. It had a theater. It had a school. It had restaurants. You go down, use the services, go back up, go to work, come back. It was this very technically moded, and that being one example of high modernism, it's the belief, and we have to recognize this in our surroundings, of that technique perspective is going to create a more rational, ordered society, which will be not only more productive, but we will all be happier. It'll be a perfect society.
Yeah.
The story, my favorite part, is that it's in the middle of nowhere. The people who were forced labor brought in, build this thing. And you can imagine these towering buildings, the labor that went into this. And it took, I don't know how long. But meanwhile, what were they doing? They were squatting. They were camping outside the outskirts. When it finally came time, they weren't allowed to live there. So when it finally came time to incorporate and say, okay, you can leave now, they're like, oh, we're not going anywhere. These are our encampment communities. This is where we live. So the government gave them squatters' rights. And those encampments became small cities around the outskirts of Brasilia, which are the most thriving part of Brasilia.
Yeah. And that's probably the vernacular building, isn't it? That's the slums, etc., the favelas or whatever. That's your vernacular building. That's what Colin Ward found most interesting. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So high modernism, is there anything that maybe you would add to that sort of understanding of, that's an extreme example. Brasilia, beautiful place to visit from the design standpoint. What drove it, what made it, it still lingers in our thinking.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling to look at specific examples around the world, I think, but the way Scott presents his ideas, I think, gives us some insights. So you mentioned earlier that police would often not go into certain neighborhoods or flats. I think that I understand what you're saying there, that we see that in this country. And you hear, I understand at different times where the violence has become particularly difficult, but you do hear stories of people that have come up to become famous athletes or famous musicians and say, I grew up in one of these projects and we had a neighborhood. We knew the rules.
But I also think our research has been observing police officers. If you observe officers who walk through a community, they talk about this in very different ways to those who drive through it. If you walk through a community, people smile at you, they might say hello to you, you might talk to people, but you go through that, you walk down the street and you have to negotiate your way with people. And it's just as orderly as any other community. If you drive through it, strangeness, you see a world you're unfamiliar with, and you're interpreting it without any interactions except through the window. And so your only contact with people in that community is when you're sent to an address where something's happened. All the stories other people tell about those places. And the police stories are always about criminality or desperation. So it's very easy to get a false impression, I think, of a place. This idea of retreating, I think the police play into it more, perhaps, than those who are trying to avoid them.
When governments have accumulated sufficient control, and in addition governed with an ideological vision of legibility, this brings about what Scott calls high modernization, an authoritarian approach on steroids. It meets a high bar for setting the rules of society, like the collective societies of Lenin and Stalin. Or a more recent example he provides, this creation of Brasilia, an engineered utopia built in the center of Brazil and named the capital of Brazil in 1960. In these examples, he provides the real stuff of his life work. Here we see beyond the immense structures and facades of society that were designed to cultivate a new kind of human being, one who would live in perfectly rational ways. While in reality, the heartbeat of society could be found in the organic neighborhoods that grew up all around the outskirts. Local knowledge provided the means to adapt and survive until the eventual downfall of the government. Scott offers us 4 elements that lead to governments that reflect high modernism. 1. Uncritical faith in scientific and technical progress as the solution to human problems. 2. Authoritarian state power, willing to use coercion to achieve its vision. 3. Weak civil society that lacks the capacity to resist these plans. 4. Administrative ordering of nature and society that ignores local knowledge. The same simplifying logic that created Brasilia appears in modern agriculture. Our conversation now turns to how contract farming reduces generations of farming knowledge to a checklist.
Yeah. I think we would be remiss if we didn't touch on some of his writings about agriculture. I think there are modern day examples that trouble me, and his writing has given me some vocabulary to express what it is that is a problem for me. But he uses the term, I was surprised, contract farming, that once industrialization of farming began, there was a discovery that once you have a farm with thousands upon thousands of animals in it, you cannot control the spread of disease. And there's such a disruption to the biodiversity of whether it's the soil or you just are overusing a plot of land. So the contract farming was this concept of giving independent farmers, he uses the word checklist, in the idea of simplification and rationalization. I'm going to give you a checklist when I show up on your farm, and I'm a big name, so I'm going to have you farm chickens. We want fryer chickens. Here's what every time we come to your farm, we want to make sure these checklist things are done. And if they don't comply with that checklist, the contract can end and they can move on to another independent farmer. So the farmers become very focused on this checklist. Over time, you don't even need a farmer. They're only paying attention to the things on that checklist. The farmer isn't thinking about the soil. He's not thinking about, does that chicken have something there kind of weird going on? It's not on the checklist, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to give them the fryers because I got to meet this contract. There's this complete dissociation of farming. The implications here remind me again of going back to a local government who said contract out these services, police, public works, and you've got people who are just coming in, I got a checklist here. These are the things that I need to do. I'm not talking to Mrs. Davis or any of the other local communities. It's not really what I'm here to do. I'm just here, if it's public works, I'm here to cut the grass. Now we have a disaster event, unexpected. People don't know the people, or they don't know the land. They don't know what gets flooded first. So you have a real lack of local knowledge, disassociate. So in the agricultural sense, I think it's a very important example of where you go from, first we wanted to just make a great big chicken farm. And I remember those big chicken farms. I had a friend who went into HR. First job was at one of those big, huge chicken farms. And they just hired mostly immigrants to come in and crack the neck. And they're just this all day. And then they shut down. So his job was to lay them all off because they went to this contract farming concept. There was just less and less of a real need for farmers. So much so that you begin to think, how many generations we see people with plots of gardens? But you have to wonder, how long is it going to be before we even know how to farm? Like, have a complete understanding of the biodiversity of the land, how the land and the soil and the animal all live together and interact.
There's some kickback against that in terms of my experience in this country. Europe actually for a while tried to bring into the agricultural subsidy system rewards for biodiversity. So maintaining ancient woodlands and hedgerows, you provide habitats for wildlife that you need because they keep your pests down. I think also the kind of degradation of the soil is getting to such a worrying level that in some places that there is no future in what we're doing. So you've got to change now before it's absolutely too late. So reinvesting in the soil has become much more important. as things get worse, it's not a particularly pleasant way of thinking about it, in the same way as my student talks about flooding in Indonesia every year. If that keeps happening, you've got to stop and think eventually we can't build golf courses and hotels and luxury spas in land that we need to absorb water and retain soil. And then you look at rewilding projects or reintroducing species that have died out in a particular place and the impact of that. I think the famous examples, is at Yellowstone, that were reintroduction of wolves and the way that actually just transformed the landscape, as well as because you have your apex predator is back, keeps the population of deer down. It's one of those examples, the ripple effect of introducing an animal that has been hunted to extinction in that place. Transforms the river, the woodland, the biodiversity. Just without you having to do much more.
Yeah.
So there is hope.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the concentration on regeneration, and those are ideas that are very important. But just to circle back around, and we're covering a lot of territory, but let's bring it back to local government. I'm just going to use Lancaster, which is our neighboring county, in the world known for their agricultural practices. I hope we never lose that. But if the free market is making it more and more difficult to compete as a local farmer, so there's an impact on local economy. So now I'm a local government, and there's a whole bunch of farmers that say, we're out. We're done. We're old. Nobody wants to run our local farms. We're going to give it over to this huge multi-complex farm. And now we got a zoning issue. Can that come into our land? And we get this huge industrial farming complex. How does that impact the community? How does that impact other farms around the area? There is a huge impact. It's not just about profit. Do we want to do this for the community, or do we want to do this for profit? But if that large industrialization occurs in or around our local community, it goes much deeper in terms of impacting the environment. And this is true for developments too, but let's just stay, because I think the agricultural is one that's really so well described in Scott's book. We're able to see that in our everyday lives. I think it's pertinent to all of the issues that local government is dealing with, including erosion. One of the world's most famous mushroom farms are a couple counties away. And when I did work there were those who had run for local government elected officials specifically on the topic. They moved into a new development, but don't like the runoff from the mushroom farms. The mushroom farms have been there for centuries. So there's a problem as to who's going to win out, the mushroom farms or the new townhome owners. It's not worked out.
And I think the problem we've had is building housing on floodplains to connect it back to the rivers. As heavy rainfall becomes more common and flooding becomes a regular feature, you can't get insurance for your property anymore because it's uninsurable. It's on the floodplain. Who gave us permission to build here? Planners. But the planners gave permission because there's pressure, and floodplains are often in the centre of lovely historic towns, for example.
So if we were to capture some summary notes here coming out of this conversation, because we've covered a lot of ground, I do think, and not that Scott ventures this direction, he does not offer prescription, but I think he would agree that having some difficult conversations, raising awareness, not being afraid, not backing off from conversations, particularly at the local level, so that you're making informed public decisions about what you're doing with your land and of your community, is rock bottom. But it also applies to your local governments, that whole issue of transparency and not thinking that policies are said and done.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways I use these ideas in teaching my students was to say, particularly ideas like bureaucracy, the idea that you can design a policy that will solve problems in some simplistic manner. You've got to actually allow for exceptions, for recognizing it when it isn't working, doesn't work, can't work. I always say it's all very well having rules. Every time something goes wrong, we can add another rule to make sure that never happens again mentality. But we also have to know why a rule is there, what it's trying to achieve. And if we know that, what we're trying to do is not a stupid thing it's trying to stop you from doing. Rules should be put aside on occasion. I think Scott And the seminal work we referred to would take it further to say, to actually get away from thinking in that kind of top-down design mentality from the start, to think differently about how we work together. What is community? What is,
Yeah.
And that's why I think both Scott and Colin Ward, the guy I referred to earlier, were not to the barricades anarchists. They were in that small way anarchists, that they thought that there's more value in that, more autonomous, more respectful, if you like, sense of community and treating people as individuals and respecting their knowledge, their wisdom and their interests. That's a different kind of understanding of anarchy. It's not about authority, it's the absence of authority. It's a collective thing rather than a chaotic thing.
We started out by saying that his work met the moment. He has so much to say about what's going on today. The amazing thing that he does is talk about very big governments, movements in history. It connects it right down to our local level today. And to be able to see that through line to what we do at a local level and how it manifests and vice versa, the top level of government is mind-blowing. I look forward to continuing to read all of his work. I hope we can have some more conversations in the future.
I think during the pandemic, I've engaged in reading groups that are becoming increasingly international. I've not been in a reading group that's looked at James C. Scott's work, but I think that would be quite interesting.
Maybe some readings. You could put together a little compendium, and that's something we could even...
Absolutely. I think it's always interesting to read something that you find stimulating and then to hear how others read it. Because you'll always see something different to somebody else, in my experience. It's one of the nerve-wracking things about writing is you're clear what you mean, but once it's out there...
It's not even yours anymore, Mike. It's for the world, us around.
Hopefully they do it in a kind of,
we should say that James C. Scott was not happy with how his book was aligned with anarchy and libertarianism. He did not intend to be cast in any kind of political way.
Particularly by the right, wasn't it? The new right, anti-state, right wing saw him as some kind of ally, and thus he was shunned by those who he might be more comfortable in terms of their company. But always risky.
And I'm glad he got a chance to say that before he passed, because it would have been really difficult had he not clarified that. We would have had some argument about what he really meant. He just wants us to think.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Mike. Okay.
Good stuff.
We'll see you.
Take care.
What you do and what you don't, what you will